My face. There we go. It's great to have you here, and welcome to Reunion Weekend 2026. Good Lord, there are people celebrating their 40th reunion that I had in class. That just shocks me. So many years after I began here, and I guess now this is about 9 years ago, we first started having conversations about things that led to HenTalks. A very generous alum gave us some money, wanted to start a speakers fund, and I said, you know, we have a lot of those already, and it's going to be hard in some ways to figure out where a new speakers fund fits. But what if, instead of inviting an outside speaker and hosting them and all the stuff that comes with having a visitor, what if we invited our own to speak to ourselves? What if we took the honorarium we might give to an outside speaker and divide it 3 ways and give a little perk to our own faculty? And what if we were to ask them to do a TED Talky kind of thing? That is a 0 to 60 sort of freeway on-ramp metaphor kind of a talk, such that you assume the audience knows not much about what you're talking about, but that at the end of 15 minutes, they will then know a lot about something that is important to you. It might be in your field, it might not be, by the way. It is completely potluck. These 3 people have not shared with me what they're going to talk about. All we have, whoops, back that up one. All we have is are their names and their departments. No serial numbers involved in this case. And I'm not going to be introducing any of them. They're going to come up seriatim, meaning one at a time. Once the other one has relinquished the floor, the lapel mic will be passed on. That will be the only interruption, and then they will continue. At the end of that time, there'll be time for questions, but there'll also be time for a hallowed hen talk tradition called Connect the Thoughts. Connect the Thoughts means that we have 3 seemingly random talks from 3 different departments. I won't call them random departments. And there will be a connection at some level between these 3 talks. There'll be more than one, in fact. And part of your task to keep you listening is not only to potentially come up with a question, but come up with a way of connecting the thoughts. Okay? It could be the choice of sport coat color they wore that day. It could be, but I'm expecting a little more from this crowd because you guys, most of you graduated from here, so come on. So the whole idea of HenTalks in its normal context, it has been co-opted by the alumni office, where I have a kind of a deep relationship now that I'm about to lead, I think, my 17th alumni trip, medieval themed, beginning in 1999. Now we're going to go in 2026 to Northumbria and do a kind of a Venerable Bede trip in the early Middle Ages, tromping from Edinburgh down to York. That connection with them has been in some ways bolstered by the fact that I've allowed HenTalks, which I wouldn't say I'd patented, but it is kind of my baby. Actually, I didn't patent it. I think I might get in trouble if I tried, because there is a sort of a TED Talky kind of a connection here, even in the color scheme of the announcement. But anyway, the whole point of that is to take something that we would normally use to give students a chance to kind of get a little hors d'oeuvre-like sense of what professors do and how they present what they do in a context that's not a classroom, where there's no homework involved. And the way it used to be, we do 3 of those a semester. That's 3 times 3 in terms of professors. That'd be 9 a semester, 18 a year, and a student could go through and really potentially almost double the amount of knowledge they have of individual professors' topics and approaches. And it felt to us like a way not only of getting students to broaden a little bit, because even in a liberal arts college, believe it or not, there's an awful lot of economists and an awful lot of computer science people, and there aren't a whole lot of people filling out disciplines like my own, which is classics. So we do our best to try to let people know, hey, there are other things on the smorgasbord table. You don't need to just fill up with the steak and the potato salad, right? Try something a little bit different. Even if it has quinoa in it, it won't kill you. And so that's part of it. And then the other opportunity is for faculty to see other faculty teach. We don't usually get to do that. And for staff to get involved in there as well. It's been a powerful thing. Then I, of course, became chair of faculty, and then I went on leave, and all sorts of things meant that it's now kind of in germ form being used in this context and parents' weekend context, because you want to come back and see what's happening intellectually, but Friday and Saturday are typically not the best days to experience that on a campus like Pomona College. So without further ado, I'm going to invite the first of my colleagues, Kim Bruce, to come up and get us started. And like I said, there'll be a little handoff between with a lapel mic, but there won't be any other further introductions. When you see me again, it will be time to do questions and connect the thoughts. Thanks for being here.
Welcome back. I've been thinking about artificial intelligence the same way that I think a lot of you have been, trying to figure out what it's about, what it's useful for, what it's not. And I should admit right off the bat that I am not a specialist in artificial intelligence. I'm a computer scientist who cares about programming languages. But I hope at the end I'll have convinced you that there's at least some connection between these. So, when is artificial intelligence usable? You ask the AI, ChatGPT, whichever one that you want to be using. You ask it for help in building a presentation. You get facts, statistics, references. Looks great, but are all those things correct? Is that a problem? It's actually how it's designed to do that kind of thing. AI today is very good at sounding good, sounding right, but sounding right is not the same as being right. So let's explore this a little bit. So a tool like ChatGPT or Gemini or Grok or whatever your favorite one, many of us have ended up using whether we want to or not. It's almost forced on us. They generate text by predicting what normally comes next. So it takes the context that is known at that point, so much of the conversation you've already had, and makes an assumption, flips a coin essentially, based on the likelihood of the next word happening, what the probabilities are. It makes an assumption and throws something in and tries to keep extending that to sound intelligent. It has absorbed huge amounts of human writing. Okay? It's basically sucked up all the information on the internet. That's a lot of information, certainly a lot more than any of us can hold on our own. It's great at mimicking patterns, the tone, and the structure. Examples from the simplest: autocorrect has been our friend for a very long time, except of course when it's not, and you end up sending messages that say the opposite of what you had actually intended. Okay? These days, when you respond to an email, you get questions, you get a suggested response, which may or may not be appropriate, but it can be helpful. Things go beyond. The question is, are they correct? And particularly early on, I started experimenting with these systems a couple of years ago, and early on, it felt like I was dealing with a student who read the assignments, knows what the keywords are, but didn't really understand really very well what's going on. So threw in those keywords because it made it sound good, but really didn't understand. Okay? In particular, it doesn't always check if the answers are correct, even it should be fairly easy to do so, which is puzzling. So should you care? Which of these things are you happy with? Self-driving cars. If you've lived in the LA area, Santa Monica, you see these Waymo cars driving all around and on the streets, and they seem fairly safe, and the statistics seems to show it works pretty well. How about your medical diagnosis? Reading x-rays may be better. Do you really want to go without a doctor to have someone prescribe your diagnosis? Air traffic control or weapon systems. There's a lot of controversy right now, and we all should be incredibly concerned about that. Now, if you're a company like Google or Meta with Facebook, then they found the perfect thing where you shouldn't care, and that is selling ads. It has been a tremendous success. They have made lots of money because of AI. It's one of the reasons that's there, and because it doesn't really matter if it's all 100% accurate. If it's 80% accurate or 90% accurate, that's plenty good. But if I'm firing weapons or I'm driving in my car on the freeway, things like that, then we really want to care about these things. I cannot possibly explain to you how these large language models work. So let me just give you something very vague. There's a black box, okay, that all this information has been fed into. It has the data, and most importantly, it has the connections between different things. So in a context where someone has said the following 5 words, it knows the likelihood of other words following that. Okay? Builds this huge database. It's got billions of entries and connections between things. Okay? Once that is built, they fine-tune it. So the original systems, if you use the original systems, didn't know how to do arithmetic. It could tell you 2 plus 2 was equal to 4 because somewhere on the web it said 2 plus 2 equals 4. But if you want to multiply together two 5-digit numbers, it just made up an answer because it didn't know how. So now it's fine tuning. Okay, they put in these extra features. By the way, I should be sure to tell you, pretty much everything I say today is probably going to be wrong a month from now. Okay, this field is changing incredibly rapidly. So in terms of limitations, especially because they've gotten good at those. At any rate, the pre-training, then the fine-tuning, and then the part where you and I get involved, where we type in a query and get a response. Okay, and basically, depending on what you typed in, it will generate an answer. It's called generative AI. That basically depends on the context that it's in and the question you ask and looking at the probability, and flips a coin, lots of choices, to see what actually happens. The problem, it's estimated 90% of the responses are correct, and it depends on where you're asking, right? Depends on the field. So I don't hesitate to ask it about if I have some medical symptoms, but whatever its diagnosis is, I don't trust a bit. I go to some reputable site and check to see if that makes sense, okay? Now, what can go wrong? And the key is almost anything. First in, garbage out. Used to be a favorite phrase, not as much. Training is essential. Suppose you had an AI which was trained on what was broadcast on Fox News, and you compare that with one that is trained on MSN Now. You're going to get very different answers on questions. So you have to think about this. Okay, how they are being trained, what kind of biases, narrow, broad. Hallucinations. If it can't find something, often it'll make it up. Lawyers have gotten in big trouble with that. Okay. Inconsistent. You can ask the same question twice in a row, and because there are coin flips used, there's probability used to make these choices, you may get different answers. Probably not wholly different answers, but different answers along the way. It's difficult to ask queries. One of the things, I don't know how many of you saw the article by President Starr that was it's on the college website about AI and the liberal arts. One of the keys is being able to ask good questions and being able to know when the answer is correct and how to check that. That's really important. There's a limited long-term memory of context. If you're using something long enough, it'll forget where it was, forget the information that it had. There's a lack of, obviously not true understanding. So let's shift gears. I do programming languages. What's a programming language? It's a way for a human being to communicate an algorithm to a computer so it can execute it. Originally, these languages were really designed for be easy for the machine to understand. These days, we try to do it at a much higher level. There are problems with natural languages. If I tell you I saw the man in the park with a telescope, who had the telescope? Did I have the telescope? Was it the man in the park who had the telescope? Natural languages are very ambiguous. Computers aren't happy with ambiguity. So we need an unambiguous language. There are lots of other restrictions that we need. So programming languages are different because one reason is we design programming languages to find errors. When we write code, and you have to be very meticulous about this, any mistake will cause huge problems along the way. So we've designed them, at least some of the languages, in ways that we find the errors quickly. So what I want to talk about is static type checkers for programming languages. Most of those words don't mean anything to you. The static part means that we are going to analyze a program without running it. Okay, if we run it, we either get an answer or we don't. The answer might be right, might be wrong, but I'd like to analyze it before we actually run that. Find the errors a whole lot easier. It's much easier to catch. So there's certain kind of errors that if we use the right type system, we can ban from occurring. We can make sure that there'll never be a case where we're taking a string and multiplying it by an address and expecting something reasonable to come out of that. Okay. Ideally, the checker should be fast and it should be correct. Here's some sample code. That's a very simple code that I had ChatGPT write for me in the Java programming language. Public static you can ignore. Boolean, that's the value is true or false. This tells me I'm writing a function called isPrime, which would tell me whether the number x coming in there is either a prime or not a prime. Because the int comes before the x is required to be an integer, and the response coming out is required to be Boolean. If something else happens there, then it's an error and it's going to tell me. Because x is an integer, I can compare it with 2. there's another integer I that's introduced. At some point, I'm comparing I with the math square root of x. Square root of x happens to be a floating point number, which is different from an integer, but it can convert it so it makes sense. That information allows the machine, okay, I can actually get my compiler to check this to make sure certain kinds of errors do not occur. And that, of course, is one of the things we worry about with artificial intelligence. Okay? Correcting errors is generally much easier if it's statically detected, that it's caught before we run the program, rather than just the thing crashes or gives the wrong answer at the end. It doesn't help you find the mistakes. The annotations make it easier to understand and modify code. I suffered from that a couple of years ago when I was trying to add on to some code that a graduate student had written who didn't care at all. It was very painful. It's especially valuable in building and maintaining large systems. If you're going to write something small, simple, you can use a language like JavaScript, which does not have the static typing, and it works perfectly fine. But if you're writing thousands of pages of programs, that's not going to be the case. Okay, so AI versus static type checkers. We do AI, we get answers that sound right. With a type checker, we have answers that can't be wrong. We're guaranteed certain kinds of errors cannot occur. There's always errors that are going to occur. We can't detect all errors automatically. There's important theorems that prove that's just going to be impossible. But AI gives us plausible answers. The static type checker gives us certain correctness guarantees, which is very important. Partial correctness, not complete. Okay, so if you have the LLM and you have the static typing, so if we have the system, actually, if we have the AI system generate code, then we can have the static type checker check it. And that's really one of the key problems we had that I was talking about earlier. You get errors. If we can eliminate a lot of those errors, again, not all of them, then it will help us enormously as we go through this. So as people have been looking at the impact of artificial intelligence on different subfields, computer science is one that it has a big impact on, particularly coding. The kind of coding, so I actually ran an experiment. We have a second course here called Discrete Math and Functional Programming, and it's very easy to type in short functional programs. Basically, the AI could do all the homework assignments in that course without difficulty. That was a very easy thing. Unfortunately, that doesn't help you build big things. In fact, one of the issues that CS faculty are going to have to deal with is if students haven't done the simple programming, how are they going to do the really large, complicated stuff? And that's the one where there's going to be huge problems. We have to figure out how to get students to that point. That's true of other fields as well. But at least here, one of the benefits is we can do this checking. We can do runtime checking, say, if you put in this answer, you better get that. And if not, let me know. But we can also do that static checking. So should you trust them in other domains? Well, what do? I treat it as an unreliable, erratic helper who's eager to help, but not trustworthy. And if it's something that you really care about, I did ask it, by the way, who's going to win tonight's baseball game, or basketball game between the Lakers and Houston, and it equivocated. It gave me a whole lot of answers why the Lakers should win and a whole lot of answers why they should lose. So it doesn't give it everything. It's now getting here. But what we need is a trusted verification system. And so one of the things I hope I leave you with after this talk is it can be really useful, can provide a lot of helpful information, it can be stimulating and give you some new ideas, but correctness is not one of the things that it's really strong on. So I asked the system, what are the limitations of LLMs? And this is what ChatGPT told me. This is copied directly. They're pattern recognizers, not truth engines or reasoning systems. Great for drafting, summarizing, translating, brainstorming, explaining, assisting with code and communication, but they need verification, they need context, and most importantly, they need human judgment. Okay? I think that's all I think that's enough. Okay, let me stop at this point.
Oops. Oh, is that it? Okay. One more. Ah, great. Hello there. Hi, yeah. I got to make sure you're all awake. Yeah. I'm Jill Grigsby from the sociology department. And I had foot surgery a couple of days ago. That's why I've got this boot on. And I may be perching like a hen. Okay, so today I'm going to be talking about a subject that brought me into the field of sociology, which is population change. And in fact, in a few weeks, I'm going to be returning to my own college, Brown University, for my 50th reunion. So a little over 50 years ago, I first learned about demography, population change. But when I first learned about it, it was rapid population growth. And recently, I'm sure how many of you have been hearing about population decline? Yeah. So what I'm going to talk about today is some of the ways demographers are thinking about this, because unfortunately, we're not hearing too many demographers talk about population change. So I'm going to give you the demographer's perspective, or a demographer's perspective, or how I've been reading demographers talking about population decline and whether fertility decline is a problem. And if we think about it, maybe how to deal with it. Okay, this is what got me into demography, was looking at a graph like this. If you see, this is world population from the time of the Stone Age, going all the way up to about, let's see, well, we see that population really didn't change much until about 1800. And then with the time of industrialization, it started to shoot up. And then it got up into, and it's projected to be close to 11 billion people by the end of the 21st century. And why is that? What causes rapid population growth in the modern era? And this is the demographic transition. It's not rapid fertility, but it's rather that there were high levels of fertility and mortality that were characteristic of traditional agricultural societies, and those high levels of fertility and mortality transitioned to low levels of fertility and mortality. But what happens in that transition is that mortality declines before fertility. And because mortality declines before fertility, population growth occurs. So here are the classic stages of the demographic transition. And you can see in stage 1, that's pre-transition, when there's no real population growth. At the stage 1, fertility is high and relatively constant, and mortality is also high and fluctuates. It fluctuates because of war, famine, and disease. Do you remember who said that? Malthus. The Malthusian is what kept population in check, so that mortality was relatively high all the time, but because of wars, famine, and disease, it would spike up occasionally. And so families needed to have large numbers of children. They needed to have at least 5 or 6 children in order for 2 to survive to adulthood. And then in stage 2, the death rate declined due to industrialization over time, because of the food supply improving, because of not so much modern medicine, but rather that people were living better lives. They were learning how to be clean. Fires were less prominent, and it was actually better food was a big part of this as well. So the death rate was declining. The birth rate, though, stayed high for a while. And so that produced what demographers call natural increase, or most of the rest of us call population growth. And then finally in stage 3, the birth rate declined. And so now in the world, we are at either the end of stage 3 or beginning of stage 4. And so here we are now in stage 4, which is a good thing. We're now back down to low fertility and low mortality. And people are concerned, but I don't think they should be, because this is what we predicted would happen. We're just in a stage now with low fertility and low mortality, and sometimes fertility is expected to be a little bit lower than mortality. So right now, you can see this is the birth rate and death rates from 1950 until projected up through 2100. And you can see the birth rate is the blue line, and it's higher than the crude death rate, which is the red line. And if you notice, around 1960, there was a spike in the crude death rate, a small spike. And that represented a famine in China, which is, it was really not well known, but there were over 30 million excess deaths in a couple-year period. It was an even more pronounced spike in mortality than our more recent spike of COVID deaths. So you can see that that was famine, and then disease is the crude death rate. So even more recently, we have had spikes in mortality. The crude birth rate has been steadily declining, and the crude death rate has also been declining. The other thing I want you to notice in some of these slides is that they show after the current year, which is 2025, 2026-ish, there is a 95% projection or prediction interval. So we're not completely sure what will happen after the present time. So that's why there's some overlap. So you can see when the lines are hypothesized to cross, they may or may not cross, because there could be some variation. Another way to look at mortality is to look at life expectancy at birth. So the life expectancy at birth shows, well, how long would a baby expect to live, a baby born at that year, if that child were to experience the death rates at that year, during that year. So in 1950, life expectancy for males was just under 45 years. So that means that a baby boy born around 1950 could expect to live to age 45 if that baby was to experience the mortality rates of that time period of 1950. Whereas by 2025, it had gone up to somewhere between 65 and 70. And female life expectancy is higher than male life expectancy, but they are kind of along the same line. Total fertility rates are another period measure, which means they also combine the rates at a particular point in time. And they would show how many children a woman would have if she experienced the age-specific fertility rates at that point in time. So in 1950, women were having close to 5 children per woman in the world. Now they're having between 2 and 2.5 children per woman. And the projections show that by the end of this century, women will have somewhere, between 1.6 and 2.2. But again, there's a lot of variation possibilities there. Okay. So here are the world population projections. And again, this is from the United Nations population projections. This is the medium variant. And so the solid line shows that it's projected to increase till about sometime towards the end of the century, and then possibly start to decline. But again, it could increase or it could decrease. And that's all within the 95% projection interval. So again, when I hear people start to get like, oh my God, we're going to have population decline. Well, we don't know, there's a lot of variation in there, and that's something important to remember. Another thing important to know about is structure, population structure. In 1950, the world population structure looked like a pyramid. We see males on the left, females on the right, and the youngest age groups are at the base of the pyramid, and the oldest are at the top. So this represents a young population, 1950. This is the world. And this is the world in 2025. Wow. So it's definitely older, more rectangular, and lumpier, I like to say. So, as it gets older, you could see the effect of the changing fertility. And so if you look really carefully at some years, you could maybe pick out possibly some mortality changes too, but I won't get into that right now. Okay, I love this graph. This is one of my favorites. World population by broad age groups. So the age group that has grown the most since 1950 and is projected to grow the most is the age group 25 to 64. And that's the age group that is, that's the labor force. That's the most productive labor force. And that can explain why, in general, our economies have been doing well. In contrast, the age group of children, 0 to 14, it grew somewhat in the end of the 20th century and is projected to decline somewhat by the end of this century. The young 15 to 24 young adult population is not going to change that much, supposedly. And then the age group 65 plus has been increasing a lot and is then going to start to level off. So again, I think this is a really important graph to look at. But again, if you look at the 25 to 64, there could be a lot of variation in that too, depending on fertility. Same with the 0 to 14. But not as much with the, by the way, with the 65 plus, because most of those people are already alive. Okay, this is another one I think is really important to keep in mind. This is for the United States, the crude birth rate and crude death rate. We already know what's happened up to 2025, but there's so much uncertainty about what is going to happen in the future. And so while we may think, by the year before, sometime in the next 15 years, mortality will be greater than fertility. Well, yes, it probably will, but we don't know. It might not be. There's a lot of uncertainty. The projections show that in the 95% prediction interval, fertility could be above mortality, mortality could be above fertility. So again, here's the total population. I mean, it's projected to increase somewhat, and a lot of that has to do with what happens with immigration. I didn't show you any immigration slides in this thing. But here's the median variant. But you can see within the 95% prediction interval, we could either see in the next 75 years, population going down, population going up somewhat, or population going up a lot. But there's not an inevitable population decline. Whoa, let me go back. Okay, so I have 2 more slides here. Resetting fertility norms and values for the 21st century. So first of all, an average of 2 children per woman does not mean necessarily that everyone will be having 2 children. I think that's really important. I think for a long time we thought, okay, everyone should have 2 children. No, 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 no. Okay, so some women or some families will have no children or just 1. I have just 1 child. So someone has to make up my difference. So others will have 3 or 4 for the average to be 2. There will also be several family types that will be acceptable, whereas in past times they might not have been as acceptable. There will be 2-parent families, 1-parent families, same gender parents. And all those family types need to be acceptable and need to be encouraged to have children. And we need to be providing social, political, economic support to a range of families. And that includes family planning, contraception, abortion, in vitro fertilization. And we also need to be providing equal access to employment, housing, education, as well as adequate health care for everyone, especially infants and children. And that's what young families want. They are not going to be convinced by a few $1,000s to have more children. They want these kinds of benefits. So to summarize, these are the trends and issues that demographers see as important. The recent U.S. fertility decline has been due to declines in teenage childbearing. And that's usually considered a positive, not a negative trend. And by the way, is something that is likely to get made up as these young women get older and decide, okay, I didn't have children when I was a teenager, but I'm going to have children in my 20s or 30s. Total fertility rate in a specific year, and that's what people tend to focus on. Oh, our total fertility rate this year is 1.6. So we're going to be then having a fertility decline and a population decline. Well, that can underestimate how many total children that group of women will eventually have. Just like it was overestimated during the baby boom of the 1950s, when during the 1950s, the total fertility rate in a couple of years was 3.6 children. And no group of women actually had that many, but it was just that high during that time period. Policies to increase fertility in the short term, like cash payments, have not been effective in the short run, in the long term. They may be effective for a year or two, but not really in the long term. It's also important to note that higher fertility tends to create large cohorts of children, and children are expensive. They are expensive. They're expensive for the families, but they're expensive for society. And they are not economically productive for 20 or more years. So, yeah, as we all know. So if the society is looking for economic reasons like labor force, bigger labor force, then immigration is a better solution. Finally, the last two things. Long-term population projections, as we saw, show large variations. So keeping that in mind is really important. And then finally, smaller populations may be better for the environment. And that's it. Thank you.
We're doing the ceremonial transfer of the lapel mic. I'm going to pass out some handouts because we have a dinosaur among us who relies on them. I should note, by the way, that our three presenters are all emeritus or emerita faculty. There's a point there. The goal is to try to be able to connect our speakers with as many of the audience as possible, and it is alumni weekend after all. So brand new faculty members and minimal contact with you folks, but with these older ones, more mature ones, here we are.
I'm not going to need that.
Oh, I know. I need that. Okay, I've got handouts. They're in little bunches of 6, and you can distribute them as
Good
more
afternoon.
or less. Hang on a second. Don't start yet.
No, I am going to start. Okay. I'm Lorn Foster. I'm an emeritus professor of politics, and I'm developmentally disabled. I have not yet moved into the 20th century. You're receiving handouts. I still work with notes. I do not type. I send things off to a typist. And I don't want to deal with technology in the way that Kim does. Okay? So, you're going to get an old-fashioned kind of presentation on something that is very near and dear to me, which is the African American Church in Los Angeles, and particularly the Second Baptist Church, which was founded in May of 1885. And one of the things I should say for the Baptist, if you go to a community, you will see a First Baptist Church and a Second Baptist Church. And in 95 times out of 100, the Second Baptist Church will be the African American Church. Okay, so the first 2 churches in Los Angeles, African American churches, were founded in 1872. The First AME Church, Second Baptist in 1885, and Wesley Methodist in 1888. And by the year 1900, each of those churches were within 4 blocks of one another. One was at 8th and Town, the other was at 8th and St. Julian, and the other was on Maple Avenue between 7th and 8th. Now, for those of you that aren't familiar with Los Angeles, that is basically the fashion district now. In 1920, Second Baptist had lost a pastor, and a supply came in the month of September, and his name was Thomas Lee Griffith. And he made it clear to his congregation at that time that they were going to have to move from their location on Maple Avenue to a different location because the population of African Americans in LA was growing. Between 1935 and 1920 and 1930, the African American population in Los Angeles doubled from 35,000 to 70,000. Thomas Lee Griffith lived at 33rd and Griffith Avenue, and he saw a vacant lot at the corner of 24th and Griffith, and adjacent to the Children's Home Society, which was a Roman Catholic orphanage at the time. The church purchased the property. They went out and they hired an African American architect by the name of Paul Revere Williams. Now, most of you have, if you've heard of Paul Revere Williams or seen a Paul Revere Williams designed building, it's probably the dome at LAX. Okay, but more importantly, Paul Williams initially got his start by designing, of all things, homes for George Flint in what is now Flint Ridge. Okay, but just think about that. Okay, you know, he was designing homes for George Flint in what became Flint Ridge. In 1924, Sutton went to then the Security Pacific Bank and got a line of credit for $125,000. And Tom Griffith, along with Paul Revere Williams, decided, we're going to do something. We're going to build a civic auditorium. We're going to build a church that serves as a civic auditorium and will seat 2,500 Negroes. Okay? And I'm using that term because that was the term then. Security Pacific Bank says, no, we're not going to fund it. Okay? And so Paul Williams did something very unique. If you do a Google search, I'm not, you could look. At the front of Second Baptist Church on 24th Street, there are two entrances that say Second Baptist Church. At the corner of 25th and Griffith, you will see that it says Sunday School. And what Paul Williams did was he divided the church. There's a wonderful colonnade balcony, and he put a screen in. And so you could physically separate the Sunday school from the church. It was a ruse, okay? But it worked, okay? The building was dedicated in January of 1926. Mayor Cryer spoke, civic leaders came out. It was a big deal, okay? So most of us think of religious institutions as places of faith, right? You know, we're going to go and we're going to be somber and we're going to have a quiet moment. And maybe we'll listen to a piece of music, and maybe we'll actually hear the spoken word that kind of speaks to us or doesn't speak to us. But African American church is very different. African American church did not start off as a faith center. African American church began as a hush harbor, a place in which African Americans could have conversations on their own, away from their slave masters. Okay? They could articulate what were their interests. They could, clearly in public, if you were an African American, you could say, I really want to be free. Okay? That ain't going to happen. Okay? So the hush harbor, the whole concept of the African American church really serving as both a sacred and a secular place has been with us basically from the first missionaries sitting out and trying to convert the newly arrived slaves. And what would occur, the slaves would retire to a hush harbor. At the beginning of the American Revolution, the reason that you have a separate African American Episcopal Church was that Absalom Jones and Richard Allen were Methodists. They were devoted to Wesleyanism. And they attended the Methodist congregation. And eventually the Methodists said, you have to sit in the balcony. And they said, no, we're not going to sit in the balcony. And they created the AME Funk Connection, which started in 1792. And Absalom Jones basically went off and became an Anglican priest, and they founded St. Thomas Church in Philadelphia. But here in Los Angeles, Second stands out as not being just a sacred place. A building that seats 2,500 persons, a 3-molar pipe organ, wonderful Judson stained glass windows. On the west side, on the east side of the building are 12 wonderful Judson stained glass windows. At the west wing, at the north wing, is a wonderful rose-colored glass above the balcony. So church, great. So what the hell happens in this building? Well, funny you should ask. In February of 26, instead of having a guest preacher come in, what do? Asa Philip Randolph, the head of this emerging brotherhood of sleeping car porters, arrives to give a public speech to kind of ask the African Americans in the community to support sleeping car porters. Okay? Now, building opens in January of 26, but it really reaches its apex, beginning of its apex, in July 1st of 1928. Well, what happened, you may ask? Well, Tom Griffith and the NAACP reach out to W.E.B. Du Bois and others to bring the 19th NAACP convention to Los Angeles. Okay? The farthest west it had ever been was in Denver. And they said, we will have Second Baptist as a site. So you have this wonderful, this wonderful picture of Du Bois sitting in front of the church. The convention was filled. The NAACP came again in 1942, and lastly in 1949. Okay? So this was a place of faith and politics. Not politics in the sense of, partisan politics, Republicans and Democrats, but in terms of advocacy, in terms of the place where you could go to hear things happen. Thomas Lee Griffith was instrumental in that. One of the more interesting things that's a sidelight that I think is important to kind of, right now we're in the world of social media, and we love it, and we know, well, everybody's got a device, right? And because of COVID, none of us want to do anything in person, right? It's every time I turn around, I got more damn Zoom meetings than Carter has liver pills, okay? And I would just like to be left alone, okay? Or to be in a room with other human beings, okay? And what was a precursor to Zoom in terms of kind of forcing us to get together in non-congregational ways? The radio. Okay, the radio was the first kind of wedge that allowed us to kind of get communication without being in a particular place. And the radio was really important in Los Angeles in terms of religion. We have this wonderful, bizarre lady who came from Canada, Amy Semple McPherson, and the Church of the Foursquare Gospel. Okay, and her radio station, which still exists, and it was a way of growing the church. Okay, so the war breaks out, and an African-American pastor by the name of Clayton D. Russell, who was not a pastor of Second, had a radio show called The Visitor, and it came on, it was a live radio broadcast. So he developed this wonderful, large congregation. And when the war broke out, he had a clever idea. This is in South Central. He says, okay, the Japanese have been pushed out. So the Negro Victory Committee is going to go and buy the old Japanese American markets and run them for African Americans. Okay? He also reached out to the pastor of Second to hold a mass meeting. Okay? And so in February of 42, he holds a mass meeting, 42,000 people, 2,500 people show up and join this Negro Victory Committee. One of the congregants of Second was a woman by the name of Charlotta Bass, who ran a newspaper. So it was a different form of communication. And again, the church was essential. Then we come to the 1950s. And the world changed a little bit in 1950, did it not? Well, for some of us. There was a Supreme Court decision, well, we really want to talk about the Supreme Court, but Supreme Court decision that monumentally changed things. It was called Brown versus Board of Education. It overturned a decision that had been rendered 58 years previously, okay? And the armed services were desegregated. And so African Americans thought, oh my God, there's a possibility of change. But African American Baptist pastors are a group unto themselves. And there's a group called the National Baptist Association. And one of the leaders was J. Raymond Henderson here in Los Angeles at Second. And in 1955, in June, two pastors and their spouses came down from San Francisco on their way back to Montgomery. And I wondered who they were. Okay? Ralph David Abernathy and Martin Luther King Jr. Okay? And those two, along with Gardner Taylor, eventually founded the Progressive National Baptist Association, which was a more progressive, liberally oriented group. So that's 55. 56, after what happens in 55, a lady comes out here on a fundraising visit. Miss Rosa Parks, to kind of quote the Neville brothers. Okay? This is the kind of congregation that kind of brings this kind of life to the congregation. Look at a picture from 1963 of the March on Washington. And if you look below Dr. King is this kind of very complected African-American man. And his name was Thomas Kilgore. And Tom Kilgore, like Dr. King, was a Morehouse man. He was called to be the pastor of Second Baptist. Okay, so church is growing. Then I graduated high school in June of 1965. Okay, get ready to go off to college. Great time to be, okay? And then all of a sudden, August 7th, August 8th, you hear about this insurrection going on along Central Avenue, kind of Vernon and Central, okay? And all of a sudden, it's the Watts insurrection. And the city burns and all of these things happen. Tom Kilgore was eventually contacted by Zumberg, the chancellor of SC, to be the kind of moderating and mediating voice between the African-American community. So churches, even to this day, serve as a safe harbor. And last but not least, as you look through those, right now, the building is in the midst of renovation. We've just received a $2.5 million grant from Preserving Black Churches and the National Trust to redo the roof, the west wall, and construction. And the area is very interesting because it's the center of the old African-American community. Second is at 24th and Griffith. A block to the east is the Lincoln Theater. 4 blocks down are the 28th Street Y, which was called the Colored Y, and St. Philip's Church, 2 other Paul Williams designed buildings. Go down Central Avenue and you will see the Dunbar Hotel. The area is very different now. It is 95% Latino. And so what it shows you is the kind of transition. But second, as a building and as a congregation, sits on the National Register and is considered kind of a center of civil rights and social justice and also faith. Okay? On that, I'm done. Okay? Fini.
I'm now going to invite our speakers to come up front here. We have a microphone for you all, and I'll take mine and one other that I will then pass around. And depending on the questions or the connect the thoughts, then the appropriate presenter will grab the microphone and and take it from there. I should have added one additional benefit to this whole thing is that I've gotten to know so many of my colleagues and what they do up in front of the group. Of these three, two of them were here when I got here, which was 1985. The other joined later, but it seems like he's been here that long. It's
Here before that.
yeah, it's true. That's true. That's true. So yeah, I just ended up arriving in the middle of his two terms. But anyway, I'm now open for questions.
Hello. I have a question that perhaps spans between Lorn and Jill. My son is 27 or 28, and he works full-time as a UX researcher, working with Google, but not for Google. So he and all of his colleagues live in a situation where they're fully employed and they make good money. They all believe they might lose their job at any time and be completely unable to get another job, and they're not sure how they should retrain, and they don't have any time to retrain anyway. So it's a weird situation for that group. So I saw on your demographics that he's right in the beginning of that useful group of workforce, but they don't believe they're going to be working. And the reason they don't believe they're going to be working is because of AI. So I wondered if you can sort of address that aspect of reality.
That's a tough question. I mean, I think that's part of why we have Pomona College. Can you hear me? Yeah, okay. I mean, I don't know what kind of education your son, did he go to, does he have a liberal arts education?
Yes.
Okay,
Went to Northeastern.
that's great.
He actually created his own major there.
Well, that's wonderful. I mean, I think realizing that what somebody is going to be doing right after college is not going to be what they're going to be doing the rest of their lives is, especially today, is an important point. That to me is, I think, the first thing. I mean, I think most of us in this room, maybe when we graduated from college, thought that that career was going to be the career for life. And that's not the case. I would say I'll start with that, but then.
This is clearly a time of great transition, and it's very difficult to be the class, the group, the age group that it's going through that, where that's really hard. Obviously, what this country should do is invest a lot of funding in retraining people. It's hard to know at this point how much of an impact AI will actually have. There's obviously a lot of people spending enormous amounts of money on this. I think it's bubblish. I think a lot of this is going to collapse. Interestingly, I asked ChatGPT, and it said, well, it's not quite a bubble. It's close to. But I think we have to realize we have some people who can be incredibly productive, and it is worth subsidizing those people and helping them make the transition, which may be small, may be large. I have no idea at this point how large a transition it will be, but it's clearly going to be a time of disruption, and we need to support people because these are the people who are going to be with us working, and they're paying my Social Security, so I want them to be productive and happy.
Am I up? Okay. So this is coming from a guy who graduated college 49 years ago. So I love, Lorn, the fact that you're not using the computer, you're doing handwritten notes. Thank you, buddy. Love that, right? But I graduated in aerospace engineering, and I hated the corporate world. And I got out as fast as I could. After a lot of twists and turns, I spent my entire career loving liberal arts. So yay, Pomona. I didn't go here, but yay, Pomona. When I was a kid, I thought STEM was everything. Now I hate STEM, and I think the world is like way too far that way. Sorry, Kim. And we need more people to solve sociological problems, political problems. So my question for the three of you, you spent your life as professors. is anybody in Pomona faculty talking about the structure of basic education? Like back to the first woman's question, you know, my gripe about education in this country is that education doesn't teach you how to be resilient. Education doesn't teach you how to change careers. Education doesn't teach you how to adapt and use the many, many talents and skills and interests that are inside of you, because education forces you to specialize and pick a major. And, you know, my life didn't work out like that. I was in retail, I was in politics, I was in nonprofit management. Anything going on in the faculty or university leadership about sort of the structure of basic education?
Well, I'll take that. I actually think that one of the most important courses that I taught when I was at Pomona, or set of courses, were courses that were writing intensive. And I used to tell my students that the most important skill, or one of the most important skills that they learned here at Pomona College, was how to write, because that skill translated to all kinds of different careers or a lot of different things. I mean, they could help. And actually, after I graduated from college, my first real job was not as a professor. It was actually selling computers for National Cash Register in New York City. And the person who hired me said, "Can you write?" Believe that's what he said. "Can you write?" And I said, "Yes, I can." And I had to actually demonstrate that I could write. I can't remember what I had to do, but that was and I had a Bachelor of Science degree in applied math. So it's not that I couldn't do the quantitative stuff, but he was concerned that I couldn't write. So I do believe that we teach students how to write and how to think. So I would think the two things of critical thinking, analysis, and writing are important.
I would add to that, and I think something that's equally as important is time by yourself. And for me, when I taught at Pomona, one of the joys was being able to come into Carnegie late at night and some knucklehead was sitting in the lounge or in one of the places, or the same thing in Pearson's. And now if I walk into Carnegie, they're nowhere to be seen. I think one of the things, or using the library, I think one of the most essential things to developing your mind is not just the choice of a major, but you've got a book to read, you've got an assignment. Do not stay in your damn dorm room. Go to a place where you can stretch out and you can sit there, and you might fall asleep, you're going to wake up, but that's your space. And it gives you a chance to kind of wrestle with either the problem that you're trying to solve or the text that you're reading. And, you know, I think that everyone needs to have places where they can go and just be quiet. And I'll end with this. The best part of my day is not being around my bride or my daughter and being able to sit down and read and maybe listen to music. That's the best time of day and the most creative part of the day.
One of the things I believe is most important, and something that you get here, I think, is flexibility. Breadth requirements, which students complain about incessantly, are just absolutely key to being able to cope with the future. As someone said earlier, you're not going to be in the same occupation your entire life. I mean, even I've spent most of my career as a college professor, but I started out as a math student here. Stan Hales was one of my instructors way back when. I went to graduate school, got a PhD in mathematics. 5 years later, I decided I didn't like that anymore. I spent a year at MIT learning computer science. Then 20 years later, I spent a year at UC Santa Cruz learning about linguistics and found some fascinating topics there. The constant discovery of new things. I mean, I almost wish I was 30 years younger now to try to explore the kind of impacts that AI is going to have, both positively and negatively, because I think the quiet, we need that quiet. We need to be able to contemplate things. We need to be able to confront things and think carefully. But I'm hoping that a lot of that is what you get through a liberal arts college, through liberal arts education, because we can't possibly train you for all the things that you're going to run into. And there is a limited amount of time. I think it'd be nice to double from 4 years to 8 years, but can you imagine paying the tuition for that? But anyway,
Before I pass on the microphone to the next question, I just have to jump in because it's close to my heart, the question that you raised. And I think there's something to be said about the accidental nature of the education at a place like this. We, as a bunch of faculty members, we're like cats, and it's hard to herd us. And we teach what we're going to teach. And yet students then, generally speaking, have 32 opportunities to prove themselves in 32 different academic settings over a 4-year period. No matter what happens in each one of those, the students learn a kind of nimbleness. The ones who do well in evaluation structures that vary greatly between Foster's, which I assume is very different than mine, and they're both different from Grigsby's and Bruce. I feel like that in and of itself is a strength. The key thing is to make sure that we are not just encouraging students, but really nudging or even forcing them to think outside the box and take courses that they don't think they're going to be neat or find useful. They get a lot of that from their parents, by the way, if they don't come from a background like Pomona College. In many cases, the pressure to do something that resembles marketability is very strong, and they get that from each other, and we have to do battle with that over and over again.
My question is for Dr. Foster. I am a Presbyterian minister, a friend of yours, I believe, Ivan Pitts. And we live in a time of danger to democracy, of growing racism, growing sexism, anti-immigration, et cetera, et cetera. You all know the litany. So I was wondering, and some of us in the churches are trying to counter this Christian nationalism that's pretending to be Christian. I'm wondering what Second Baptist is up to right now, and if there's any way some of us whiter, we're not all white, but whiter churches can join you. But I would love to be on a mailing list and know what you're up to.
I will be happy to give you information. Is this thing on? Okay. The former pastor who just passed away on January 11th was a dear friend of mine. And when he was retiring, I asked him for a favor. And I said, I want the pulpit one Sunday. And so I got the pulpit the last day in ordinary time in Pentecost. And this is a African-American Baptist who was trained at Union, who followed the common lectionary. And that's what part of what was attractive. You wouldn't use all 4 lessons but one. This is kind of getting in the weeds. So I had the idea that I'm dealing with African Americans and very insular, they consider themselves progressive because of King and the history of the church. So what I decided to do was preach a sermon on Matthew's Gospel, the 25th chapter, verses 31 to 46. And I think you know what that is. It's about what? Yes, I am. You're my buddy. Okay. But it's about
goats.
the least of us. Okay. And it's a series of questions. It's not a declaration. It's a parody or pairing between the speaker and his audience. And, the ideal is to figure out ways to deal with the least of us. In the case of the Baptists, they have a piece of property which I'm helping them to get demolished because it was taken over during COVID by displaced people. Okay? But you can't just kind of throw them out. We've got to figure out and work with the city to figure out ways. So faith institutions, some faith institutions are doing what they can to figure out ways to deal with it. This is not just an African American issue. It's an issue across the board. And faith institutions are in a particularly kind of difficult place because, we can take text. Dr. Wolf there, teaches Augustine. And, you can proclaim a faith tradition and, sacred texts are like bad dope. And you're saying, whoa, where did that come from? They've been stepped on more times than Carter has liver pills. Okay, you know, if you take a piece of scripture and you say, boy, I really like this piece of scripture, what translation are you reading? Okay, I love the 1611 Bible. Okay, I'm old fashioned and crude that way, but that's not authentic. Okay, I don't know what the original text said. Okay, I don't know what David's Psalms originally came out to be. I don't know the Exodus story. I know what I read, and that's very difficult. And so, in a civil society in which you have this kind of interaction between faith and politics, it's always going to be a problem. And I'm going to leave you with this. A friend of mine, we were talking, and they were going to Edinburgh. And I said, you've got to start off at Edinburgh Castle, castle, and walk down. And on the left side, you're going to run into Whiskey Society. And then you're going to run into the cathedral and think about John Knox. And you go further down, and guess what you're going to run into is the gravesite of Adam Smith. And the reason I mention this, I was in Edinburgh, and it was Pentecost Sunday, and I went in the cathedral to take communion. And so I'm dumb as a post. I'm thinking, oh, it's an Anglican cathedral. No, it's Presbyterian. I went out, took the host, and crossed myself. And I said, oh, Mary, Mother of God, I really screwed up here. Okay? But this is what happens. You know, you can't take text, you can't take these things and say that they're universal, that they apply to all of us. And so it calls for discernment, it calls for caution, and it calls for lots of caution. I'm sorry that I went off.
I wanted to comment on the question of what about kids who are worried about their future. For me, it's more grandchildren who are worried about their future. But I'm guessing that of the 100+ people in this room, you've got 100 different stories about what Pomona meant to them in their future planning. And in many, many, many cases, there was not a huge obvious connection. But we did learn to write. We learned to think. I was an econ major. I spent most of my life in Washington, D.C., working for elected politicians. And I took no government courses, no political science courses, no international relations courses. And I was an idiot not to take advantage of that opportunity, but I didn't see it in my future. I was in the Peace Corps in the Bolivian Andes in 1968 when all America was falling apart. And I was fascinated by what I saw. And I came back and I went and got an MBA of all things, because that was only 2 years. And then I went to the lawyer's town of Washington, but it worked out. And there was no way that somebody was going to help prepare me directly for what turned out to be something that I really enjoyed doing for a very long time. So I would say to your kids, they're better equipped than they know for what may come next. And if they can't see it, then join the great majority of people who can't see it, but hopefully will recognize it when the opportunity comes, because they've got a great grounding, whether it's at Pomona or a lot of other places. I mean, that's what liberal arts is supposed to do for us, writing and the rest.
Really, just to add to Al's point, the field I ended up in was basically more related to you, Professor Bruce, which is computer science. It didn't exist in 1966. There was no computer science problem. So the education I got here got me into a field that didn't even really have a program yet. So I was prepared for it, and I got it, and I was very good at it. I majored in music, by the way.
I should say that while I was a student here, I took every CS course that was offered. There was one.
Me first? Oh, yeah? Okay, good. This is for Professor Bruce, a question. You put up on the board, these systems that we had to think about whether AI should be running them, like air traffic control and weapon systems, and I've wrestled with that too, like I'm concerned about that, but at the same time I think of kind of the Captain Sully dilemma, where the pilot who landed on the Hudson, and that was a creative decision that AI probably could not have been able to do if it had been in charge of the plane. But at the same time, the increasing automation of flying has given us the safest flying record that we've ever had, because so many crashes are caused by human error. And the pilot is tired, they forget themselves, there's lots of issues in there that AI would not have. So what do you think the balance maybe that we should have, where we might lose these sort of creative Captain Sully moments, but what we gain in the everyday, someone's tired, accident might be worth it?
Yeah, I like to think of these AI systems as personal assistants, things that help me make better decisions. So I want, if I'm in one of these highly automated airplanes, I mean, modern airplanes can't fly without computers. If the computer system goes down, you're pretty much gone. Oh, sorry.
It's on, but
It's on. Okay. Yeah. So these systems now need the computer. The question is there going to be human intervention, and is that going to help or hurt? Right? There are some things where decisions have to be made so quickly that maybe you can't have a human in there. Others where the consequences are so great, you don't want to have a system make that. One of the interesting things that I've seen is in the news maybe a couple of months ago, I think it was testing radiologists. They had AI looking at these x-rays and trying to diagnose. We're doing a really good job compared with the human. But what would happen is after a couple of months of doing this, the radiologist lost the ability to be able to find these things. So the people became more and more dependent. So those are really difficult questions, and there are all sorts of issues. I mean, the classic philosophy problem. You've got a trolley that's out of control. You've got, some old person sitting on the right side, and on the left side, there's a small child. What do you do if you're the one who's steering that? I mean, questions that we don't want to confront, that systems will have to be trained to do things on. And that's going to, in some ways, force us to think about things we would rather not think about. But my own preference is to always have human intervention possible. And that if I'm going to depend on the computer, I want it to be tested incredibly well. Ideally, I would understand it. One of the problems with the AI systems is that we cannot extract from these systems easily the reasons why they came to that decision. That's one of the things that I was kind of hinting at there. What we really need to do is to be able to analyze the solution, to understand that it is or is not correct, and then trust it or not trust it based on that.
And then there's calling strikes and balls in baseball.
Okay,
Which seems to be working fine, right?
No.
But there's no lives at stake.
No, there are no lives at stake, but it doesn't make any sense. This is
Come on,
an
how many
imprecise-
people are patting their head in the middle of a game? Yeah.
Yeah, but this is an imprecise game with imprecise rules. Okay. And
Indeed.
So allow it to
Sorry about that.
Sorry.
Okay, we have a question.
Okay, first of all, a comment coming from somebody who worked 37 years in high schools, some teaching and a whole lot of administration, that the discussions of the philosophy of education and, to me, the importance of writing. I think that was valuable. However, as a history major who read Malthus and population stuff, I'm looking at the material presented and wondering what an overlay of global warming and environmental catastrophe might do to what was presented to us. And I expect a complete answer. Yes, in writing.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for saying that. My main point in doing the presentation today was to counter the concerns that people have raised, like Elon Musk, who say we should be really concerned about fertility decline, and say, no, we should not be concerned about fertility decline. And I did want to end with the point that I truly do believe that smaller populations would be better. I agree with you. I mean, to me, that's the important point, that I think a smaller population for the United States would be better, and probably for most countries, a smaller population would be better. How small, I don't know. And I'm going to guess that the populations will decline and that they might go up again a little bit. And I do believe that fertility rates will come back up a little bit and then they will go down. I mean, that's what we will expect will happen. But we're not, and I also believe that we will see and this is part of a longer talk that I've given at other places. We will see our social institutions change. Like, we had religions develop over millennia to support high fertility. We're going to need to see our institutions change to support relatively low fertility but moderate fertility in a way that will support this range of families to have 1, 2, or 3, or 4 children, but do it in a way that is good for everybody, in a way that's not just supporting large numbers of families, like 6 children, which took thousands of years to do. I don't know if I answered that quickly and succinctly enough for you. Did that?
So I don't mean to beat the dead horse of the retraining discussion, but I have, I think, a different perspective from a lot of, I was 25th reunion. I think a lot of people in this room are a little older than myself. So I did retrain, and it was really freaking difficult. I was a history major. I was a teacher for 10 years. And then I was like, oh, I think I want to be a nurse. So I had to go back. I did 5 years of prereqs. I had to take them at the part-time at the community college. I had a kid. I had a mortgage. I had a husband, thank gosh, who could afford for me not to be working, like 100% not working. I had 4 grandparents to provide childcare. I luckily lived 2 miles from the community college, and I could do things online. And then I had to struggle to get into nursing school, which even when you're a straight A student is very difficult nowadays. Then I had to pay for nursing school, $90,000 out of pocket. And then I had to make it through, and we're attacking clinicals and night shifts. And then I'm like 45 and starting where my colleagues who are starting are 23. Your mind doesn't work as fast when you're 45. Your husband isn't as flexible when he's also 45 and is like, what? He's wonderful, but like that wasn't what he signed up for either, you know? So I feel somewhere out there your child's fear that like, and maybe he really likes what he's doing and he doesn't want to lose his job and have to find something else. So I just encourage, absolutely, at Pomona, we learned how to learn. And I certainly employed that in my journey, and I'm very happy and I never regret making that change. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody who didn't know what they were walking into. So just remember that. So
There's still time. And I haven't heard a single connect the thoughts. Not a single one. And there's at least 4 that I've thought of.
So a possible connection, and that's the human comfort brought by the reduction of insecurity having to do with chance and contingency. And so we need corrections, the human touch with AI, but we also need something like that touch in studying or imagining what the story of the Exodus looked like before it was written down, and we can't get to it. It's so much that's vaporous. When you were talking about in sociology, a lot of predictive stuff, and the hope that we'd have immigration to offset reductions, but that's emigration. And what are the impacts on those communities that we're receiving immigrants from? And there's so much that's contingent and based on chance and what's happening now. And I think we have to get comfortable with that and keep trying.
Then we'll move directly to the next question, which will be the last one. Here, try this one maybe a little bit better.
Is that better? Yeah. Yeah, thinking about the retraining as well. I think when I was in college, I figured that the demographics of I would work until about 65 and then retire, and then new set of challenges. But yeah, it's looking more and more each year that I will, probably need to. Or I was thinking that it would just be good to supplement work beyond 65, and now I'm thinking that AI could take work, and then I'll be retraining after age 50. So I'm just wondering, I was reading a book called Longevity Economy recently, and thinking about the structures of having people work beyond their, that planned retirement age, and incorporating it into institutions, whether it's like just the politics that are needed for it, the computer related challenges that are, driving it. And I guess my first question is like, just, is the demographic showing that people are working beyond 64 now? Are we going to be adjusting some of those demographics? Thank you.
I'm going to answer this personally. I walked away from this place in 2018. And, thank God for TIA and Kraft. I'm not a pauper, okay? And as long as markets continue, I'm fine. I'm working harder now than I was when I was teaching at Pomona, trying to manage a not-for-profit, okay? I'm dealing with city council persons. I'm dealing with contractors. I'm dealing with foundations. I'm thinking about how to kind of create a capital campaign. And I'm 79 years old, and I've got a dear friend who just says, well, Lorn, why are you doing this? And I'm having more fun than the law allows. But it's still, you kind of ask yourself, most people are sitting around and eating bonbons. And, I'm working, and it's kind of, we have the possibility that we can continue, but in a different way than we did for that period, let's say 25 to 60 or 25 to 65. You can continue to work, but not in the same capacity that you did during your primary working years.
I would just like to add to that I think most people are going to need to be working past a traditional retirement age of 65. I think that the percent of individuals who are saving for retirement is, I think the last statistic I saw was around 50%, and the amount that they've saved is not really enough to sustain them during retirement. So we'll be seeing people working in some kind of capacity, maybe part-time work. So there will be full-time jobs maybe up through 65, and then part-time work after age 65. I think the idea of like what is work, and you kind of touched on that, our idea of like what is work is going to be changing over the next 50 years.
Yeah, I think the one thing that we all have to confront at some point is the physical and mental stresses that we put on our bodies. There are a lot of jobs that you cannot work well after 65, after 67. I cannot do intellectually the kind of things that I did when I was in my 30s or 40s. My brain is kind of softening at the same time that my bones are. So I think that while people are going to need to, because we haven't saved enough, and that's going to be a big problem, we have to understand that there are limitations and have to adjust and find some other way of being productive, or at least some way of making ourselves happy.
So I want to thank you and all of you for coming and making this possible. Without you, none of this really happens, because if there's two people in the audience and we're outnumbered them by the presenters, not a good thing. So this was a wonderful, robust crowd. Great questions and wonderful self-revelations too, which we always expect with an alumni gathering. That's the best part of it. But I want to extend a special thank you to my three colleagues who, when I asked them, immediately said, sign me up. And that always makes my job a lot easier. So thank you very much, you three. We will be slowly but surely clearing this room, because there's going to be another event they're setting up for. If you want to intercept our speakers, the best place to do that is probably out in the anteroom before you enter this building. Thank you very much.